Okay, so when thinking about growing minds, I was trying to think of the subject for this TEDx discussion today. And I thought, well, growing minds, in terms of looking at my own expertise, growing minds is not just about academic development, but of course, growing minds is also about social and emotional development. And this, in terms of then thinking about what are the references, what are the frameworks that young people draw upon when they're today, in today's world, when they're developing their own view of the world, how they react with other people, how they react with their peers, how they behave with their families and at school. And of course, it's inevitable in today's world that much of the influences that people draw upon, or that at least they're exposed to, whether or not they draw upon them, do come from online. Now, this must be a familiar picture to anybody who's got a teenage child. They tend to spend most of their time plugged into one device or the other. But what are they really doing on there? Well, we often hope they're doing their homework, but never really quite sure. But what they're really doing, of course, is connecting with each other. They're building relationships online, and that they're using social media and internet and phones to actually communicate with each other, but also, importantly, to learn behaviors and to learn how they interact with each other. Now, I'm hoping... Oh, now it's completely gone. Oh. No, we're not there. Oh. No. Ah, this is the one. Okay, right. So here we have another familiar sight. Young people on their phones. Is it a problem that they're using phones in terms of their relationships, in terms of how they relate to one another, particularly when they begin to move into maybe sexual relationships or more sort of adult relationships with each other? Research has shown that quite a high percentage, of around 20% in the States, there's no statistics in the Philippines, of young people are actually sharing explicit images of each other via their phones. And that same piece of research had another figure, which was slightly more worrying, I think, which was that 25% of the people who received those images decided to send them on and share with somebody else. Internet Watch says, research shows that 88% of images that are self-made, explicit images that end up on social media, internet sites, social media sites, are actually stolen. So once those sorts of images are made, it's really quite hard for young people to keep control of them. And to lose those images can be devastating, can lead to bullying, can lead to blackmail. So we need to be thinking about what are the frameworks and what are people, what references are the young people drawing on when they decide, is it okay to do this? What image is okay to send? Which image is not okay to send? The other thing that young people use the internet for, aside from their homework and other watching videos and TV, a lot of young men spend a lot of the time on the internet watching porn. And that may be shocking, but it's actually true. Figures globally differ, as you would expect, from different cultures. But a fairly modest figure, one of the lower figures that I could find, was around 40% of young men regularly access explicit material online. There's a much lower percentage for young women, But they around 13%. I think my mic's stopped working, has it? Around 13% as opposed to around 40% for the boys. And the question that then arises is, well, is it harmful? Does it actually harm young people long term to be looking at these images online? Research is unclear. Basically, there's insufficient research, I think, in terms of what are the outcomes, particularly the longer-term outcomes. But I think what we know is that in the short term, it does impact on young people's behaviors, particularly their behaviors between each other. One thing we know about the sorts of images that they're looking at is that they don't portray real life. That's not what real relationships are like. That's not really what real sex is like. Which is worrisome, because the reason that most young men, at least, give for looking at explicit images online is that they're curious and they want to learn about sex. So that has to concern us then, that if these young people are looking at these images and think that there's something that's slightly real, there's something real's being portrayed, because it's clearly not. Evidence has shown that regularly watching online porn does lead to unrealistic expectations about sex, an inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy, particularly amongst young men, maybe accepting some sort of traditional gender roles, or where the woman is submissive, which is also worrisome. And of course, many of these images also will have an abusive or a violent aspect, which is probably why the young women are not so comfortable actually looking at it. So aside from, obviously, the images and video, of course we have music. And when we're looking at the sort of gender roles that are portrayed in rap music, but let's not just give rap music a hard time. There's lots of other types of music that maybe doesn't portray the type of positive images that we might want for our young women. But what can we really do? What can we really do? Can we limit the internet? No, not really. You can unplug the router at night. You can try and put some parental controls onto your laptop. If you've got a teenager in the house, they're probably going to get around those controls quicker than you can find new software to put on. They've all got mobile phones. They all can connect to the internet. So once they're out of the house, you've lost control. So I don't think that it's realistic to think that we can actually control the internet. What we can do is think about what are the tools we give the young people, so that when they come across images, when they come across negative gender stereotypes, when they come across violence or abuse, or situations which they don't understand, what have they got to draw upon to try and help them navigate those situations and come out with what we would hope would be the right sorts of decisions? I think one of the key things is that, my belief at least, is that we have to equip young people to make those decisions themselves. Actually trying to make those decisions for them won't work. And I think that some of the traditional models that we've used to advise young people, where we might be able to give scenarios and say, this is right, this is wrong, don't do this later, wait for this, are harder. I think that they're harder to impose, and I think they have less relevance when you have such an array of scenarios and such an array of external influences impacting on young people. So what do I think is a solid foundation for our young people? Well, I think actually human rights and actually thinking about how we can teach young people about equality, teaching them about bodily integrity and autonomy, self-determination and self-expression. Well, why? Why do we want our young people to understand these things? We want our young people to feel that they have control of their bodies, control of their relationships, that they can determine themselves what they do. They also, of course, need to understand that in determining what they do, they need to be aware of the rights of others within their community, within their peers, within their families, and within their schools. Now, comprehensive sexuality education is a bit of a hot topic, and it is a hot topic, I know, in the Philippines. It's the same the world over. It has its supporters and then those who don't. Lots of parents particularly worry that comprehensive sexuality education will lead to the onset of early sexual behavior. It will lead to promiscuity. But 2/3 of all the studies that have been carried out over the world show a sharp decrease in the onset, in the age in terms of the onset of sexual activity once you have comprehensive sexuality education within a school. It also leads to young people thinking more in terms of their behaviors and how they behave with each other. One of the topics that is most controversial within comprehensive sexuality education is the issue around sexuality, sexual identity. And that's, I know, is a very difficult subject for many parents to think about discussing with their children, and indeed for many schools to actually discuss, because, of course, parents are very worried about those issues. But I think we have to remind ourselves that globally it's accepted that there's 10% of the population who will end up in a same-sex relationship. That means within every single class, 2 to 3 students. And in a school the size of BSM, maybe 80 students, 80 of our current students. Therefore, I do think we owe those children, we owe their families, that we need to think about how do we have a supportive environment where we're able to respect sexual diversity and help people make sense of their evolving development. And we also need to understand that, of course, that when young people are growing up, many people may well consider themselves to be attracted to somebody of the opposite sex whilst they're growing up, but actually, ultimately, when they become an adult, have a heterosexual relationship. This is a quote from the UN in terms of comprehensive sexuality education. It's quite interesting to note that the actual UN define access to comprehensive sexuality education, or CSE, because it's quite a mouthful to say, as a human right itself, that young people have the right to know to health and the right to information. They have the right to have access to the full comprehensive range of information that they need as they grow. But it's not really the sort of technical aspect of CSE that I want to talk about. I actually think that that is an aside. And to a certain extent, we got a lot of the sort of basics of sex education. You get some of it in biology, and, you know, all forms of sex education gives you the basic mechanics. But I think that what CSE gives, and this is where I think it's critical for today's young people, is that it does help them think about positive values, critical thinking. It gives them assertiveness. We want young people to be assertive in their relationships. We want them to be able to define what they want. We want young women to be equipped to recognize situations where, which they feel uncomfortable in. We want young people, as I said earlier, to be able to balance their rights with those around them. I think CSE and focuses on relationships. It doesn't really focus on sex. It focuses on respect. It focuses on gender roles. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a young woman today? What does it mean to be a young man? There is growing concern globally about a crisis in masculinities, a crisis that young men are the ones being left behind, that there is much discussion about what's the positive gender roles for young women today, but what is the positive gender roles for young men? If they're, on one hand, getting influences which are very much about male dominance and, you know, sort of the old hunter-gatherer type of stereotypes, and that you can get the girl anytime you want and she's going to do exactly what you want her to do. If that's the sort of references they're getting on the internet and from music, but actually in reality, around them in their peers, they're at school with girls who have aspirations, girls who are going to have careers, girls with whom they have friendships. How do young men, where will young men get these positive role models and positive references from? So, I'd just like to end by posing a challenge to educators, both within the Philippines and those outside, is to think about human rights not just as a standalone subject that you teach, but looking at human rights and the human rights frameworks as a framework for life, a frame to teach our young people some of the basics, principles that we hope will guide them on the way, and not just think of it as something that's taught, but also try and reflect on how that can be integrated right across curricula and policies within the institution. So, thank you.